You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Professor Jason Lantzer. You may have heard his name since he's a professor at Butler University, teaching history there. And I just told him I completely just stumbled upon his book about Dwight Eisenhower and the Holocaust, a history. That's the title. Stumbled upon it reading a completely different book, ordered it, read it in 3 days. It's fabulous. Jason Lantzer, thank you very much for coming on the Leaders and Legends podcast.
Robert, thank you very much for having me.
Let's dig into this.
All right.
Because I learned a lot through your book. Some of it I knew, but some of it I didn't know, especially with regard to Eisenhower and his commitment to making sure the Holocaust was remembered, that things weren't just swept under the, oh, that didn't happen, that's crazy, that's too much. But we'll get into that.
All right.
So let's try to marry the two subjects together very quickly in the sense of it's World War II. Most people have a basic idea of what Dwight Eisenhower is doing and has done, did do for the Allies. But let's go to the spring of 45. The war's basically over. Hitler kills himself April 30th. But both the Soviets and the Western Allies are starting to encounter the concentration camps. Set the scene for us a little bit, because we want to focus on that time period first.
Sure thing. So the war is racing to what many observers believed was going to be a glorious conclusion, that the Allies had effectively defeated Germany and were about to smash the Nazi capital of Berlin, not just north, south, east, and west, but also from the air. It was a complete victory, and in many ways a very real vindication for Eisenhower on the Western Front with a broad front strategy instead of picking one route and heading straight towards Berlin. He wanted to sweep through all of Germany and make sure that the Germans knew that they were defeated.
And why was that important?
Because there is a prevailing myth within Germany emerging out of the end of the First World War that they hadn't actually been defeated, that there was a stabbed-in-the-back myth that developed because there are still German units about 50 or so miles deep into France when the armistice is signed, in retreat but still not in Germany. There's a very brief Allied occupation of certain portions of Germany following the Great War. But there is this sort of very real feeling within German, especially military circles, that they hadn't really been beaten. They had just been betrayed by politicians. And so one of the guiding principles for especially the United States throughout the Second World War was to make sure that Germany knew it had been defeated.
And that's one of the reasons why at the Casablanca conference, Franklin Roosevelt, the American president, basically blurted out unconditional surrender.
It's become very much a maxim of American military thinking since at least the Civil War and Ulysses S. Grant, that we fight until the other side completely surrenders.
But yet, the Germans, who you said didn't believe necessarily that they had lost, they blamed it on the politicians. Was there a particular religious group that they lumped in with the blame?
So one of the groups that gets blamed, especially as the teens give way to the 20s, are Jews. And anti-Semitism, which had largely been under the surface of Imperial Germany, begins to bubble back up to the front. And that is wedded with very much a worry and concern about the rise of communism and the fact that many of the communist leaders within Germany were also Jewish, and as well as in the Soviet Union and the Bolshevik movement, many of those leaders had been Jews. And so there's this synergy in the minds of some Germans that Jews plus communism is what undid our country.
So you have a situation in April of 45, Germany's collapsing, the Western Allies and the Soviet and the Red Army are about to meet at the Elbe River. What is going on in Eisenhower's mind as he attempts to put a bow on all this? Because it's going to lead him to the visit of the concentration camp, the work camp.
So this is very much, he's feeling relieved in some respects for the first time since taking the job. So back into 1940, they can see the light at the end of the tunnel. He is, in fact, so excited at this moment or pleased that he's even entertaining ideas of possibly an American and British incursion to assist the Russians in taking Berlin. They are moving incredibly fast. German forces are both retreating and surrendering in large numbers. We'll learn after the end of the war that the Germans had preferred to surrender to the Western Allies as opposed to the Soviets. So that definitely helped matters. There's a little concern that there might be sort of a final stand by some of the Germans, especially the SS and the Alps. Eisenhower is very concerned about making sure there are troops available moving into Bavaria to either cut that off or cut that down very quickly. And there's this sense that the end is indeed in sight. And the morning that Eisenhower ends up visiting Ohrdruf, he and Generals Patton and Bradley are actually visiting the Merkers salt mine. And the mine is a defunct salt mine, but it is a mine that the Allies had discovered the Germans were using to hoard looted goods. If you've seen the movie The Monuments Men, this is
right.
highlighted in that as well. And so they'd visited that. They were in good spirits. There's a little gallows humor as they're taking this very rickety elevator down about what would happen if the elevator broke. And they make some jokes about that. Patton makes a joke about, wouldn't it be nice if some of those gold bars ended up just in the Third Army's coffers? And everybody's in a good mood. And then it's going to change when one of Patton's aides suggests that maybe they go visit this camp, Ohrdruf, that the previous week some of the Third Army had discovered.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. We are discussing with Professor Jason Lantzer his book, Dwight Eisenhower and the Holocaust, A History. So let's switch gears. Obviously, I'm not going to say explain the Holocaust. What's it Les Nessman did on WKRP, remember? Explain fire when he was interviewing the firemen. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about how the Holocaust had crept into the knowledge, into the frame of reference of the Allies in World War II prior to the spring of 45.
So it's a very interesting creep of knowledge, as I think maybe is the best way to describe it. On the one hand, there are certain people, Franklin Roosevelt among them, Winston Churchill, who know what is going on. In fact, we know what is going on. And by we, in the general American public, we know that since 1933, the Nazis have been targeting certain groups. I say we know that because it's published in our newspapers. Not always on the front page, not always the lead above the fold, but we have knowledge of what's going on. There are refugees from Germany who are telling us that they are being targeted. And a lot of those refugees are Jewish. So we have a general sense, but by the time the war is happening, we also have some specific details that are emerging. As the Nazis swept over Europe, Several of the countries that they conquer, their governments get out. They form governments in exile, usually based in London. And they still have connections back to, say, the Netherlands or to Poland. And information is getting out. It's being assembled. There are also especially some Jewish groups that are very interested in trying to figure out what is happening, especially once the war kicks in. And there are various reports that make their way into the halls of power. Now, when it comes to the Army, to, say, Eisenhower, there's two other things going on. The first is that the people in power, say Roosevelt in particular, have determined that while there might be something going on, that there's definitely persecution, that we know about these camps, that is not a top priority in terms of fighting the war. The sort of line that emerges out of Washington, D.C. is that the best way to end the camps is to win the war.
Right.
And so you win the war, and there's a good deal of truth in that. If you knock the Nazis out of power, they aren't able to do these things anymore. It's also a wonderful blanket statement that allows you to not have to do very much of anything. Not that in, say, 1942, when the United States finally becomes engaged in the war, there's much we could have done. But each year, the evidence is mounting. Each year, the knowledge is growing. But for Eisenhower, it is that focus is his order, and his order is to win the war and how to best do that.
And there were refugee. There were laws that determined how many folks could come in, immigration laws, and then obviously there was some anti-Semitism here in the United States. So
Absolutely.
You had lots of deterrence within the United States and its laws that doesn't excuse our inaction, but it explains the legal remedies available at the time.
Absolutely. There's no provision for a political religious refugee class within American immigration law as it exists. We are under a quota system that dates back to the mid-1920s from a particular country. And there are a certain number of Germans that are allowed to immigrate. There are also restrictions put in place because of the Great Depression. And remember, we're going through that throughout the 1930s. And one of the things that happens within immigration law at the time is that if you were attempting to leave a country, you had to prove that you would not be a drain on the country in which you were going. A pauper was one of the terms that was often used. And as such, Jewish refugees in particular are in a tough bind because while the Nazis were more than willing in the 1930s to allow Jews to leave the country, in fact, that was really the official policy, was to expel them, they were only allowed to take a very limited amount of what we would deem as wealth or capital. And so even if you were a very wealthy businessman, let alone if you weren't, you basically had to sell your business to the state for nothing, or it was confiscated. And so you didn't have any money to move with you or to say, look, I'll be okay. I used to do this. Then you also needed somebody to vouch for you in, say, the United States. And so it was almost impossible to get out.
How did the United States immigration policies, much influenced in the 20s by the Klan and other open-minded organizations, How did the United States compare to, say, England, France, Soviet Union, Italy? Were we any better or any worse?
We were about the same. England and France both have very strict limitations. No one in the Great Depression. And as much as the laws are from the 20s, the attitude is from the 30s and is going through the Great Depression. Most European countries do not open their borders up to refugees. They are also struggling through as well. Now, you'll have some limited success amongst Jews of getting into places like, say, the Netherlands, to a degree France as well, especially towards the end. But the problem with that is they are buying themselves a year or two because eventually the Nazis are going to sweep into those countries as well.
So it's fair to say they had no place to go.
Yes, that's very much so.
Let's talk a little bit about Germany and the years leading up to Germany declares war on, invades Poland. I think it's September 1st, 1939, and in concert with the Soviet Union. And it's a subject for 50 podcasts. But as you get closer to the war, Nazi Germany ratchets up its oppression its killing, its dispossession of German Jews. If you could just give us 2 minutes about, look, this is what we're facing here as the concentration camp system starts to get, is it Dachau's the first one?
Yeah.
Starts to really get rolling.
The system begins as a re-education, rehabilitation, at least that's what is officially proclaimed, that this is something that you could be sent to and then eventually you would get out of. Very quickly it becomes evident that a lot of these people who get sent to the camps aren't going to be coming home. An instrument at first for the Nazis to round up supposed troublemakers, to enforce laws that they push through to better, in their opinion, German society. And once the war starts, the camp system is going to expand. Suddenly you've got to include prisoners of war. You've got another problem that develops for the Nazis, which is you're going to have to do something, right? You have, and Hitler has labeled this since the 1920s, that the Jews are this massive problem that need to be dealt with. At first, maybe it was expelling them if they could be expelled. But where were they going? They were going to places like Poland and France, places that the Nazis are now taking over. And so by late 1940, early 1941, there's already discussion of what are we going to do? How do we solve this quote-unquote Jewish problem? And the end result is going to be the Wannsee Conference. Wannsee is this wonderful little lake town outside. It's in between Potsdam and Berlin. And the Nazis are going to convene a conference to come up with what we know as the final solution and really kick into what will become labeled as the Holocaust, which is that they are going to exterminate Europe's Jewish population.
Did Hitler or one of his henchmen, didn't they coin the term world Jewry? They made that sort of a rhetorical boogeyman?
Yes, absolutely. The Jews were, in the Nazi parlance, the Jews become the source of all problems. And one of the reasons that the Holocaust becomes justified in the minds of many of the Nazis is you have to eliminate all Jews, because if you allow the next generation to live, say children, these children are going to remember what we did to their parents and come after us. And the best thing to do is to kill them all.
How did the concentration camp, the Auschwitz, the Buchenwald, Dachau, Treblinka, how did that system come into place?
The camps evolved from these sort of prison camps very quickly into labor camps. And one of the proliferating factors that goes into the camp system as a whole is that the Nazis have all these people that they are, in fact, taking out of the workforce at the same time that they are launching a war. And so one of the things they believe they can help solve this problem, because they're also taking people they classify as real Germans out of the workforce too and sending them off to fight. The labor camps become just that, or these concentration camps become just that. They become labor camps, places where the camps can be placed near towns, cities where there's industry or the capability for industry. Sachsenhausen, for example, near Berlin, which is the closest camp to Berlin, is built in large part because the belief is they'll be able to make bricks. It turns out the bricks are absolutely horrible and they really never get used for much of anything. But the belief when that's opened in the mid-1930s is, this will become a brick factory for the state. And in some respects, an inexhaustible supply of labor. You can continue to feed more prisoners into the camp. It also becomes this it solves some problems for the Germans. You're sending these people to the camps. You really aren't going to ever release them, but you can work them to death. And so it becomes a form of capital punishment in a way. You're being sentenced to work until you die. And we're going to speed that up by having some pretty shoot-on-sight kind of orders if you get out of line. We're also not going to feed you very much, so eventually you'll starve to death, but that's okay too. The next evolution of that is what we would call the death camps. These are the Auschwitz generation of camps. And these come out of the Wannsee Conference. They are extermination centers. Now, Auschwitz is a vast camp, and it has, it becomes best known as this extermination center, a place where Jews arrive in the morning and are dead by the evening.
They're selected off the train.
Yes.
So when's the Wannsee Conference?
Wannsee Conference is in the latter part of 1941.
So would it be accurate to say that the Holocaust and the mass killing isn't something that got ginned up as soon as Hitler became chancellor in 1933. The hate was there, the motivation was there, but the Wannsee Conference, would you say that's the true watershed?
So, to a degree, yes. I think the Wannsee Conference is where they make a move. Now, up until the conference, Jews are being killed, they're being rounded up. You've got what is happening, especially once the Soviet Union is invaded and Germany does that in the summer of 1941. Not only are you bringing in more and more prisoners, including more and more Jews, and encountering them, but you are seeing executions being done, going into villages, rounding up the Jews and shooting them. And one of the problems that the Nazis begin to realize or uncover for themselves is it's an incredibly inefficient system. Now, what scholars will point out is that most Jews are actually killed in the most of the Jews who die in the Holocaust don't die in gas chambers. They die in these sort of mass execution events, clubbed to death. It's one of the authors I think I cite in the book notes. It's the very antithesis of what we think of as this industrialized killing machine. But the whole point behind doing the gas chambers and the crematorium are that you can kill more faster. And it's, in the end, cheaper than, Zyklon B doesn't cost nearly as much as all the bullets that it would cost to kill as many people as you can kill in as short a period of time. So,
how much of the construction of the camps and the mechanisms, how much of that, if any, was designed to help hide what they were doing?
So that's a very good question. Camps themselves are built as a high watermark of the Nazi imperial moment.
Which would be late 41.
Through 1942. Really
right.
Until Stalingrad, late 42, 43 is when the tide starts to turn on the Eastern Front. D-Day will happen in June of 44. So the Nazis are trying to deal with this problem of having many more people under their control than they had just even a few years before. And so they're working their way through this problem as they see it, right? And the camps become this wonderful way to make Nazi ideology happen. The whole point of, say, moving Jews out of Germany, and while there are a lot of concentration camps within Germany, the death camps all are in Poland. The whole reason to remove them from Germany is to make Germany free of Jews.
Right.
And that's one of the issues that helps precipitate the Wannsee Conference, actually, is that a portion of Poland had been taken from Germany. Poland is recreated after World War I.
East Prussia
is out there dangling. You've got Danzig sitting up there. And this is now returned to Germany after September of 1939. And the German administrators don't want Jews living in their portion of this reconstituted Germany. Okay, push them further east. Now we've got all these people, right? So one of the other things that happens as the war starts to turn, is that the Nazis begin to realize that maybe they aren't going to win the war, or that people aren't going to understand what they were trying to do. And so the best thing to do is to cover up what they did. So you've got a slew of examples throughout, especially the Soviet Union, but then into places like Ukraine and even Poland, where by late 43, 44, the Nazis are digging up bodies from these mass execution spots and burning them in order to try and cover up what they had done. Again, that's one of the nice things, if you're on the Nazi side of things, about the gas chambers and the crematorium, is that those bodies are disposed of very quickly. And so it's going to become a massive cover-up, or an attempted cover-up.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. Today, our guest is Professor Jason Lantzer. He's up at Butler University. He has written a fabulous book, which if you I hope you'll buy, and once you buy, you will not be able to put down. The book is titled Dwight Eisenhower and the Holocaust, A History. Okay, we know what Ike was doing. We know what the Germans were doing. How does that come together?
Here come the Americans. We are sweeping across Western Europe, and our forces are already beyond, in some areas by early April, where they will end up being, where the Yalta Agreement has demarcated where the Allied zones of occupation would be. But Eisenhower is of the opinion that we take as much ground as we can. We've got to make sure that the Germans are defeated, and it's become, in some respects, very easy to do. Not that there isn't fighting, not that people aren't dying, but that
you have 80-year-old soldiers, you have 8-year-old soldiers.
The Germans are running out of men. And frankly, the Germans had also shifted a lot of what remained of their better units to try and keep the Soviets away from Berlin.
Because they know what's going to happen.
Because they know what's going to happen. That war, the war in the East, is a war of extermination, because just below the Jews on the Nazi sort of hierarchy of people that they don't like are Slavs and the Slavic people. So that had been a war of scorched earth almost from the get-go as well. So the Americans are pushing, and in early April of 1945, units that are under Patton's overall command have stumbled, and that's the way this happens throughout. It's the language that you will see used continually by Americans who are the first to go into any of the camps. They stumble into the discovery of Ohrdruf, and it's played out time and time again, but it's oftentimes they find a straggling prisoner, somebody who made it out of the camp. The Nazis, this is one of the weird moments in World War II. As much as some Nazis recognize that they are losing the war, there's also this belief that they've got to keep what they do have. And so you've got what become known as the death marches out of these concentration camps that cause more and more prisoners to be forced marched from camps that are in the path of advancing Allied armies to camps that are further and still firmly under German control. So you've got all of these people milling about the roads, and eventually what happens is that American soldiers near Ohrdruf come upon some of these people. They get pointed in the right direction. As they interrogate people along the way, they hear that there's some sort of camp. They decide to go investigate, and then they discover a concentration camp.
Is it fair to say, if I get my chronology correct, and you describe this in your book, did the Russians stumble upon the concentration camps first, coming from the east, so there was some knowledge?
Yes.
Is that right? Auschwitz, they liberated that, came upon that?
In January of 1945. The Soviets had come upon, by the time Eisenhower visits Ohrdruf, the Soviets have already uncovered or discovered or liberated all of what we would refer to as the death camps and several other of the concentration camps within Poland. And there is some media coverage. There are some Western journalists who are with or are come over to the Soviet lines. But there are a couple of things working against, say, the discovery of Auschwitz in January becoming this huge event. The first, on the Soviet side of things, is that the Soviets are just as shocked. The soldiers who liberate these camps are just as shocked as their American counterparts are going to be. It's really the Soviets who coined the term living skeletons to try and describe these prisoners who have survived. But within the Soviet political structure, Joseph Stalin has already made it quite clear that when talking about the war and the war's victims, the Soviets need to always make the case that they are the chief recipients of Hitler's rage. They are the ones who endured the most, and there's a lot of truth to that.
That's a great point you make in your book that I thought was very interesting.
There's that going on, and that means that even once you start to suss out the fact that, wait a minute, some of these prisoners are Jews, and maybe Hitler was actually following through on the things he had said, and he's trying to eliminate the Jews, that we can't let the fact that Jews are being targeted, trump the fact that the Soviet Union was attacked.
Because you have 20, 25 million. The number goes up every year of how many Russians, Soviet citizens who were killed during the war. Plus, before the war, obviously, Stalin is no stranger to genocide.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that makes that Nazi-Soviet pact that occurs in 1939 that allows the war to really begin so interesting, is that you're really dealing with two totalitarian dictators who've decided for a minute that they aren't going to attack each other, they're going to attack other people.
Hannibal Lecter and Jeffrey Dahmer deciding, we'll sit down to dinner, but we just won't eat each other.
Yeah, I understand what you're doing over there.
And I don't judge you.
Yeah. I mean, I might do it a little differently, but that's fine. So the Soviets, one of the things that will continue through at least until Stalin's death in 1953 is that if you want to talk about Jews dying, that's fine, but are they Soviet Jews? And if they're Soviet Jews, then we don't really need to refer to them as Jews. They were targeted and they died as Soviets, Soviet citizens. So you've got on the one hand, the Soviets aren't going to play up that angle of what we'll come to call the Holocaust. On the other hand, when you've got Western reporters that send back their stories to their editors, you've got a lot of disbelief that what is being reported is in fact true. And part of that has to do with, and this feeds into why there isn't a more concerted effort before 1945 on the American side of things. There is disbelief in the halls of power in Washington, and to a degree London as well, about whether or not things that are being reported about these camps are in fact true, or if it's just propaganda. And in the American context, this is a very real concern. Propaganda is viewed as someone at a conference I just attended labeled it as a dirty word. You didn't want to be seen as engaging in propaganda. What you were doing, we might be doing propaganda, but we don't use the P word. We don't call it propaganda. And this dates back to the First World War, when Great Britain had utilized a good deal of propaganda about what they labeled as the rape of Belgium, about things that the Germans were doing to Belgians to incite anti-German sentiment in the United States to try and convince the U.S. to join the war effort. And then after the war, we discovered that almost none of those stories were true. Yeah. And so there's this notion of, we can't believe it because we don't see it. And even if something happened there, which we aren't necessarily disputing, we can't prove it. We're going off of your story, and you're getting your story from the Soviets, and we know how much they hate the Nazis. And so while
let's write about Audie Murphy.
Yeah,
let's write about the American. Yeah,
let's focus on us, right? And again, you also, the other thing I think is important to keep in mind when it comes to news coverage of the Holocaust is, even when these stories make it into the newspaper, and by the late 1944, 1945, you've got people who are making the rounds and talking about this at different places. I think I even found a reference to one of these speakers that makes it in one of the Indianapolis newspapers. But the sheer amount of war news that is being plastered on the front page and really the front sections of newspapers, this means that something like the discovery of a camp in Poland is going to pale in comparison to what is going on the American sector of the line. We've got a whole other war that's happening against Japan.
We haven't even mentioned that.
There's just so much. And then there's the stuff that you're going to report because it's happening in your town, your community, and regardless of the war. Mm-hmm. And so it's just not percolating through. It's not seen as a top news, really worthy story. It's just another thing that's happening in the war.
We have about another 15 minutes with Professor Jason Lantzer. He is the author of the book, Dwight Eisenhower and the Holocaust, A History. Take us back to Ike. I'd like to really focus on him in the final minutes that we have here, the final 15 minutes or so. Ike goes to the camp.
He goes to the camp. One of Patton's aides says, "Hey, we discovered this camp. Would you like to see it, General?" Eisenhower says yes. They journey to the camp, and right away Eisenhower is shocked by what he sees. This is not what he or most of the soldiers that are with him would have thought when you said this is a camp, that in the American mindset, that's not a prison camp. We don't have those. What a camp, as one of the liberators calls it, if you had told me the Germans have a bunch of camps, I would have assumed you were talking about YMCA camps.
Sure, Boy
it's
Scout.
a summer camp. Yeah, it's not this. And Eisenhower insists upon seeing the entire camp. They're at about the 2-hour mark of the trip. Some of his aides are trying to get him to leave. He tells them no. He, in his words, I have to get this. And by that, he meant he needed to see every nook and cranny. He needed to talk to survivors. There are survivors at Ohrdruf. Not all of them had been death marched to Buchenwald or executed before the Germans left. He has, at one point, his official interpreter is not with this party. So he's coming from Eisenhower's headquarters. Eisenhower pulls or gets assigned a soldier who speaks German. The soldier tells Ike, he says, General, my German isn't that good. Eisenhower says, don't worry, mine is just fine, but I need time to process what I'm hearing.
And it's not lost on Eisenhower that his last name is Eisenhower.
No, it is not. He is very much a German American. And it's also something that the Nazis had not been lost on them either. That this is the fact that he's leading the Western Allies is proof of how degenerate the United States is, because it has corrupted a German. But he tours the camp. They go into a building in which there are bodies that are stacked. Eisenhower goes in. He comes out. Patton, the story goes, pokes his head in and then immediately walks out and throws up. Eisenhower will tell the soldiers that are there before he departs that he has heard that they don't know what they're fighting for, but he says he hopes that this shows them what they're fighting against. And that starts a chain reaction.
Again, to your point, much different than the Pacific War.
Much different than the Pacific War.
Where the Army and the Marines and Navy had no problem hating the Japanese.
Yeah.
None at all. But in Europe, it is a little bit different. And please tell the story, because I actually have it in my notes, of what Eisenhower says to the one soldier. He snaps at him. And you tell it in your book. I'll give you that hint because I know your book's not exactly 3 pages long. Have problem hating them now?
Yeah. Do you have a problem hating them now? The soldiers are trying to process this as well. And the guys who are there aren't the ones who had initially liberated the camp either. So a lot of them are arriving at about the same time or just a day or so before. And they are really not sure what to make of what they're doing or what's going on around them. And
these are battle-hardened veterans. I know there's a new crop of soldiers as we get towards the end of the war who didn't land on Omaha Beach and such. But these guys weren't just helicoptered from Newport Beach either.
No. These are almost all of them have seen combat, some of them for several years, all the way dating back to North Africa. But this is different. And in my take, this provides a clear change in Eisenhower and how he sees the war. Prior to this, obviously the Germans are the bad guys and we're the good guys. That's the sort of, right, us versus them. It's a very, in some respects, sports mentality. And if you spend much time with Eisenhower, you learn very quickly how much he likes sports and competition and what a competitive guy he was. But the other part of it now is there's this moral sense to what they've been doing. And that the Germans maybe aren't as much like us as we wanted to think. How could this have happened? And you find this peppered throughout Eisenhower's letters in the coming weeks as he just cannot wrap his head around how this occurred amongst people that are quite literally just like him in so many ways. And so that moral clarity leads to him not just making sure that as units pass through this camp or other camps, and this is one of the amazing things that happens, is Ohrdruf is first, it's a sub-camp. It's nothing compared to Buchenwald or Dachau, the two major camps that the U.S. is going to liberate in Germany proper. But it's the first. And within a week, Eisenhower is now getting reports of more and more camps. And his general order is that as units, as long as they aren't pressed in the fight, as units pass through these areas, they are to visit the camps and to see for themselves what they are fighting against. And that moral certainty also carries into another thing that he does, which is he wants to unleash a press offensive. He writes within a few days to George Marshall, who is chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, requesting an official congressional delegation. He informs Marshall. He's also contacted Prime Minister Winston Churchill asking for Parliament to send a delegation. He wants politicians to visit the camps. He also requests that newspaper editors be sent over, that other prominent Americans come and view these camps for themselves so that no one can claim that this is propaganda, that no one can claim this didn't happen, that this never is allowed to happen again. And not only is that a massive difference than, say, the Soviet response, it's also, I think, important to point out that this is also happening at the exact same time that the country is mourning the death of Franklin Roosevelt. Eisenhower visits Ohrdruf on April 12th. On April 13th, he's informed that Franklin Roosevelt has died.
On April 12th.
Yeah, on April 12th. And so at the same time, the country is grasping at, wait, who's this Harry Truman guy that's going to become president? And how does this impact the end of the war? Eisenhower's saying, you've got to send people over here. Because this is why we're fighting, and people come. It's actually the congressional delegation, the first congressional delegation that goes, and there are also congressmen and women who are already in Europe who, once they hear about the camps, show up as well. But that first congressional delegation is the who's who and of prominent politicians on both sides of the aisle and from both chambers of Congress. And there are some members of Congress who are upset when they aren't allowed to go in that first official delegation as well.
There was another group of people whom General of the Army Dwight Eisenhower wanted to see the camps. Who would those be?
The other part of this sort of moral reckoning is that Eisenhower wants the Germans to see the camps for themselves. In fact, he orders German civilians in the proximate locations of where these camps are discovered to tour the camps. He will also give instructions that they are to help clean up the camps and to care for the prisoners. This is sometimes, and I mean that not in terms of how emotional it is for the Germans to go through the camps. I mean that they try very hard to not look, and U.S. soldiers will pry their hands down away from their faces and make them look. And
didn't the American forces maybe turn their back on a retributive act as well? Did I say that right, Alan? Yeah. Retributive act as well?
There are at least one, probably more, documented cases where when the camps are being liberated, and Dachau is probably the best example of this, that American troops just don't help German guards that are captured when prisoners have weapons and go after them. The point with German civilians, though, is that this is going to continue. Eisenhower will be the first military governor of the American zone of occupation following the war. He's there for about 6 months. He is the one who puts in place denazification. Really, any success we have in denazification is owed to Ike. He puts all that stuff into place. The Nuremberg trials, he plans the fact that the Nuremberg trials occur in Nuremberg instead of Berlin. That is an Eisenhower move. He wants it in the American sector. He wants it so that we control it. He's been to the Potsdam Conference by this time, and that was in the Soviet zone of occupation, and he did not care for how the Soviets ran things.
That's July of 45.
Mm-hmm. And Nuremberg's going to kick off in November, and Eisenhower will leave Europe in November. He says to go home to go fishing, but that doesn't last very long. But he puts everything in place at Nuremberg. But this will include that this continues after that sort of immediate period. That Eisenhower is going to authorize U.S. Army Signal Corps to go in and make films of these camps. They'll put them together, package it into a movie, and German civilians in places where there aren't camps close by will basically be forced to go watch this film. Now, how much they take in, hard to say, but that's part of this process as well. And it also leads to this very poignant moment in the case of Ohrdruf. One of the people that has to go visit the camp is the mayor of the town, this community where this camp was located. He, his wife, and their daughter will commit suicide after visiting the camp, and he leaves a note in which he says, "We didn't know, but we knew." And that, for Eisenhower, really sums up what the Germans' experience was. They knew what was going on in the camps. They chose not to do anything with that knowledge. They opted not to know officially what was happening in their name, sometimes literally right down the street.
What's the legal term for that? Willful blindness?
Yeah.
But I'm not here to be counsel for the German people, but what could they have done? Looking back, given the nature of the Nazi police state, what could this mayor have done, or other mayors or political officials or generals, that wouldn't have caused them to be thrown in the camps?
It's a very good question, and it's a lot easier to answer it when you've got the American flag behind you, as opposed to being in a Germany that's becoming Nazified. However, a lot of these towns and communities actually work to get these camps located near them. They see them as economic engines.
They saw them being marched from place to place.
They see these prisoners being marched. These prisoners are often working in factories that are in the towns beside the camp, so they see them all the time. If the camp is close to a major city and that city is bombed, the prisoners are the ones who are on cleanup duties. They're on, if a bomb hasn't exploded, it's been done, they're the ones who are sent down to try and make sure that it doesn't explode, or if it does explode, it's prisoners who die, not Germans. So they could have not lobbied to have camps placed there. There's also this, I think it's a very American sort of take on, well, why didn't they just stop Hitler to begin with?
That's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, it is. And resistance to the Third Reich does exist, but it's nowhere near what we would hope. And it's also a reminder of just how easy it is to go along as opposed to taking a stand on an issue.
And it's easy to make the argument that the Germans were looking for revenge because they couldn't possibly fathom. I read a lot of sort of Bismarckian, Wilhelmine Germany history, and the loss in World War I to the Germans was unfathomable.
Absolutely. That loss, it reverberates through that generation because, as I think we said at the outset, if you were in the Army, you didn't feel as though you had been beaten. You feel as though the politicians had basically taken that victory away from you, or at least the opportunity to have some sort of settlement. Now, granted, soldiers on the front lines don't always know what's going on back, and Germany is falling apart socially in the late fall of 1918.
They're starving.
They're starving, and there's political turmoil, and the will to win, or the will to continue the war, is dissipated because the summer offensive had failed, and it's obviously clear by the summer offensive in the West that they're going to lose the war. They're going to have to face some sort of negotiated settlement.
And it's interesting, you read the letters of the Germans who were still fighting after the Americans come in, their comments, their observations of the American soldier, how much bigger we were, how much more muscular, how much taller, everything. They're like, we can't fight against these supermen. What are we doing?
How much stuff we have. And that's especially true in World War II. We grind Germany down with our industrial capabilities.
Does Eisenhower's worldview as it relates to the Holocaust persist until his death in 1969?
Yes, is the short answer to that. It changes Eisenhower. The war changes Eisenhower in very real ways, and the Holocaust is at the center of that change, especially as it becomes obvious that this wasn't just something that happened. This was part of a deliberate plan. Eisenhower is going to be probably among the first to proclaim the idea that this can never be allowed to happen again, the sort of never again slogan that gets attached to the Holocaust. And part of that is not just the Holocaust, but the war. This is a guy who has unleashed, up to at least the late summer of 1945, unfathomable destruction on a country. And then with the use of nuclear weapons to end the war in the Pacific, that's going to change, as he writes, very soon after the bombs are deployed and Japan surrenders. The moment the bomb is deployed, that changes war. And so he's seen the destruction that just conventional weapons can do to cities. German cities are flattened. And so all of this has to never happen again. We can never have a war like this again. We can never allow an ideology like the Nazis to drive us to the war, because look at what these what they've done to their own people and to the people they've conquered. And it shapes his view. He's always an American. He's always a patriot. But it comes to shape his view as well of the Soviet system. That he will, by the time he's president, view the Soviet Union as just a totalitarian state, not unlike the Nazis.
Last question before I ask you the 5 questions that we ask all of our guests. How much different, how much worse would our knowledge and documentation of the Holocaust be without General Eisenhower's effort?
I don't know that we would have documented it anywhere near the way that we document it. Eisenhower really kicks off. Would there have been trials? Yes. Eisenhower's a very early proponent of war crimes trials. In fact, at one point, he's ordered to stop talking about it. Schaeff is not supposed to talk about it. That's going to be something that the government in Washington will decide. He is adamant that these documents get collected, that we produce as much evidence. In fact, when the Americans are putting together our case for Nuremberg, eventually the various councils just tell Eisenhower to stop sending them stuff. They have too much evidence. They can't process it all. They don't think they need it all. He's done such a good job. And part of that is because the Germans also kept excellent records and didn't destroy nearly as many as maybe you would think they should have. So he kicks off this notion. You could very easily see this being a footnote instead of a central part of how we understand the war, because if you look at any Soviet-era history of the Great Patriotic War, as they call it, this is almost relegated to a footnote.
We've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Dr. Lantzer, are you ready?
I'm ready.
What was your first job?
My first job was working to help pick up construction materials. My uncle had a independent sort of construction business, and my dad would work for him part-time, usually on weekends, and I got to tag along sometimes to pick up scraps.
What was your first concert?
My first concert was probably, let's see, who was it? It was Damn Yankees and Jackal at the Joyce ACC.
That's a first, Alan, I think, on that double bill. Number 3, if you could suggest, these questions get progressively more difficult.
Sure thing.
Not more embarrassing, just more difficult. If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Well, you're talking to a historian who's
I
written
know, that's
books.
why I said they get
obviously,
tougher.
Dwight Eisenhower and the Holocaust is where you should start. I think one of the books that influenced me the most as a historian was, actually, I'll just say this, just pick up anything by Gordon Wood.
Oh, the Revolutionary
great
era.
American revolutionary historian, yeah.
If you could witness any event in history, Professor Lantzer, which one would you choose?
It's probably a toss-up between the signing of the Declaration of Independence or Washington surrendering his commission to Congress at the end of the American Revolution.
If he does this, he will be the greatest man in the world. Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, just to chat, whom would you choose?
That is a tough one. They've got to be living today. This is a Homer answer, but it would probably be Mitch Daniels, our former governor.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister, a veteran of World War II. Our guest today has been Professor Jason Lantzer, Butler University. We discussed his book, Dwight Eisenhower and the Holocaust, A History. Dr. Lantzer, it was a joy to read your book. I learned so much, learned even more in our discussion today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com. veteranstrategies.com.